jump in. Good to be with you, my friends. I'll hit the share screen button. See if I can get everything. This usually goes quickly. I'm sure there is like one button to press, but I still haven't learned the one button trick. I'm gonna learn that one someday. All right, so last time we finished up with chapter 6. And if you recall, that was the feeding of the 5,000 men, or perhaps 5,000 people. Language is not clear there. And the walking on water, which is really as much a theophany as it is the moment of walking on water. Which gets us straight into chapter 7. Unlike the last couple of chapters where we sort of had these narratives that clearly connected one to the next, this one is not as clearly connected. Seems to be just the next story that Mark wants to tell more than there was some grand connection or overarching narrative that fits together. But hey, we can talk about that too as we look at it. We get 2 stories, basically of grumpy Jesus. That's the best way to say it. The first, well, we'll look at both of those stories and see how Jesus is dealing with critique and challenge in very different ways. And sometimes, well, both times he has a good answer, but he sort of shows that he's getting annoyed at best, or perhaps even angry with a lot of folks and how they're treating him and the people around him. So it's a very human portrait, I would say, is what we're getting today of Jesus, if nothing else. After literally being revealed as divine, walking on water, now we see him sort of coming back to earth and just being unbelievably human, which is good. So 7th chapter, 1st verse. Now when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around him, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders. And they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there are also many other traditions that they observe, the washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands? He said to them, Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites, as it is written. This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to the human tradition. Then he said to them, you have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to keep your tradition. For Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and whoever speaks evil of father or mother must surely die. But you say that if anyone tells father or mother, whatever support you might have had from me is Corban, that is an offering to God, then you no longer permit doing anything for a father or mother, thus making void the word of God through your tradition that you have handed on. You do many things like this. All right, so I broke this up a little bit. He continues, but I'm going to stop because he's saying a whole lot all at once, right? So there's lots to engage, especially we have named first, right? We are Christians watching Jews fight about Jewish law and custom. You just have to name that, right? I mean, that's the reality, and that's the first and perhaps the last thing to say on it on some level. We aren't Jews, and Jesus is a Jew and understands his ministry and it both as a Jew and in a Jewish context. So for him to have this conversation is a very different conversation than the ones that we can have 21 centuries later, and without knowing all of the details of everything going on. What we can do is do the best we can to sort of piece it together and see what he's talking about. There are different levels. That is, there's custom, there's traditional, there's law, and all three overlap in different ways. All right. So first, what we can name, there are 613 commandments for the law of Moses. Just a basic fact. And then there are many, many interpretations because no law can cover every situation, right? I mean, this is the reality of our legal code and every legal code that has ever existed in the history of humanity. There are books and books, as I'm sure Lynn could tell us much more detail about than many other attorneys could. There are literally books that interpret laws, which interpret laws, which interpret the interpretations, which interpret the laws, right? It's lots of layers. It is just as complex in the Jewish faith and, quite frankly, in the Christian faith. It's not any different for any of them, because for every time you say, thou shalt not kill, someone goes, well, but what about these situations? Is it okay to kill in this situation? Or what about that situation, right? I mean, there are all of these things that you have to take into account and walk through. And almost every time there's a commandment, you can usually find something that is different, right? And so some of this is like case law. And again, I'll defer to attorneys on this one, but as I understand case law, that is where there is not a written rule, but everyone knows how to deal with a similar issue, right? Like established case law is, well, everybody bases their work on how they understand this law or this series of judgments to be understood. So it's not actually the law, but it's how people understand that law to work. The commandments of Moses for Jews, and quite frankly, the 10 commandments in Christian tradition, are all handled a lot of times with case law as much as with the actual reading of that word, right? Did I get that right, Lynn? Is that about? I'll ask the question of the attorney, knowing that might go down a rabbit hole, but
Yeah, that's fair. That's a case law and precedent.
Yeah. So it's important to name, because I think today's lesson is about case law in a lot of ways. It's not like there's a very specific rule here. It's much more how do people deal with these interpretations, right? So some issues go to judges and courts or temple authorities. Still other times there's an exemption to rules and traditions, or a tradition that cancel each other out, right? Sometimes you'll have two rules that seem to apply. Which one do you choose, right? Which we talked about before, right? Preserving life trumps all the other rules, as far as any rabbi that I've ever talked to will say that if your goal is to preserve life, then you can lie and you can do all kinds of other things if the goal is to care for someone in that situation, right? And to preserve human life in existence. All that to say, this is getting into sort of a legal argument, right? Here's the keys. There are no direct rules to wash hands from the law of Moses. There aren't. There's nothing that says a good Jew will wash his hands before he eats dinner. Now, it will say that the priests should wash their hands before they do any sort of sacramental role, right? Like, so if I'm going to celebrate, in our context, if I'm going to celebrate communion, I should wash my hands beforehand, which is good health, but it's also the rule of the law of Moses has that application, right? Like if you're going to enter into certain activities as a priest, you should wash your hands. All right, so that's pretty straightforward. And what we know next is that the Pharisees, as a group, as a political party, were known for wanting to extend the rules for priests to the people. They sort of had this idea of the priesthood of all believers, as we would say in the Christian church, that everyone on some level was a priest, or at least supposed to be dedicated to God, so they should be following more of the rules of the priest, and it should not necessarily be just the priest who wash hands, but the people who wash hands before meals and all kinds of other occasions, right? Maybe this is one of those moments. What every scholar I read and everything that I've seen about this is this might well be a almost political debate. We might even, to make it super contextual, say this is about wearing masks, right? On some level, like there are very clear political parties and people standing on different sides of the issue. And they knew the context in the first century, but it's hard for us to put it together completely in the 21st. But it sounds like the Pharisees were trying to say, hey, everybody who's a faithful Jew should wash their hands. Most scholars, though, think that Mark's assertion that all Jews wash hands is not accurate. That is, maybe all Pharisees washed hands, and they encouraged others to wash hands, but it was not a religious requirement to wash hands, right? Anyway, all of that said, in Judaism, there's also that long-standing tradition that I've talked about before of being careful to prevent temptation. That is, you build a fence around a law, right? So it's to try and prevent temptation. So that it may well be the case here as well. But what we can say is Jesus is not advocating eliminating the law or overturning it at all. He doesn't say like, well, you're not supposed to wash your hands. He doesn't debate that point. He has a different point of debate. And we have to go to his example for that. So let me stop there. Does that largely make sense? Do people have questions about this? Because again, this is where it's super easy for us to be overly simplistic about this and go, oh, well, Jesus is right because he's on our side, right? We like Jesus and he's fighting those evil Pharisees. But again, this is a little bit more of a legalistic debate than it is necessarily a purely theological debate. All right, the example might help. The example might help. So here's the example Jesus has used, right? The law is clear that you should honor your father and mother, right? He quotes that. That is one of the 10 commandments. We all heard it. We all know it. And typically in the 21st century, when we hear honor your father and mother, that means you better listen to mom and dad and do what they say, right? That's how we interpret it now. But when it was pre-social security or social safety net, this was about not just obeying your parents, but also caring for your elders financially and socially in every way, right? Like this was an era where if your parents outlived their financial means, then as a family, your job was to take care of your parents. That's how you would honor your parents, make sure that they had a place to stay and food to eat in their elder years when they ran out of money, quite frankly, or resources, or all of the above. That you'd bring them into your house, or you would sell part of your property to fund their life to make sure that they could be okay. So the law is clear. Jesus says the law is clear. This is what you're supposed to do, right? Pretty straightforward. But then he says, hey, Korban, you would all say, oh, Korban, that is an oath, which is where you dedicate some item or of one's property to the temple, right? So in this case, and in this context, what Jesus appears to reference is the practice of some who dedicated their property to the temple so they could not sell it to support family. In other words, this was a sort of traditional tax loophole, right? Where they could say, well, hey, I would love to help you, Mom, but the temple owns the land. I can't sell land that I dedicated to the temple. The temple now owns it, so I can't help you out in your old age and your destitution, right? So that's what Jesus is critiquing when he says all this kind of like, oh, you said, the commandment is to honor your mother and father. We know what that means, but then you'll all say, oh, well, it's Korban. I've dedicated my money or my land or both to the temple. And because, the priests are going to get it and God's going to get it, I can't help my parents. Now, what do we know about that? There's a scholar, Jerome, but he was, of course, writing about 300 years later, 350 AD. And this is a quote directly from one of his letters. It frequently happened that while father and mother were destitute, their children were offering sacrifices for priests and scribes to consume. Don't know if that's completely accurate. He is closer than us, but he may also be exaggerating a little bit since it's 300 years after the burning of the temple. But there is some evidence both from him and from even some Jewish sources that say this might have been a somewhat frequent practice of like, oh, well, I want to make sure family gets into heaven or that we're connected and in the right parts of society. So we'll use this rule of dedicating land or money to the temple so I can get out of helping out other parts of my family that I don't want to help out. And maybe not just parents, but also cousins, nephews, uncles. You were, again, in that era, you were supposed to take care of all of your family. That was part of honoring your father and mother, was to say, well, their cousins are part of your family too. And just to make sure we cover all of it, Jesus does say, and you do many things like that, right? Like it may not just be this, but here's one example of how y'all use tradition to get out of following the law, right? It's specific abuse of the system that benefits the priests and the Pharisees, incidentally, but clearly violates the intent of the law of Moses, right? So again, this is where I could ask the attorneys on the call, but it's a pretty good basic legal argument that Jesus is putting forward, right? The intent of the law is to care for your parents. You're using a bunch of loopholes to get out of the purpose of the law in the first place, which means you're not following it, right? So in that context, we can hopefully hear Jesus's critique more clearly, which is not, oh, well, then we have to throw the law away. It is, no, we have to follow the law. You're just not doing it. You're using all these other weird traditions and customs to get out of doing the stuff that you're supposed to do. In other words, you're washing your hands and acting like that's the most important thing, when really the most important thing is how do you care for God, right? So he wants us to follow God's law over those traditions and customs that religion brings. Now, before we engage, I do want to be very clear. Care for your parents, feed the poor, welcome the immigrant. This is what Jesus talks about over and over again. And let's be honest, there are lots of rules that might impede that, that might stop us from doing that, right? And not just in the Jewish tradition. The church, I know Jesus would have the same critiques of his church at times over our history, right? This is a debate that we can say, oh, well, that's what he was talking about to his Jewish friends, and the church is so much better. We're the same. We're the same. There have been many years where we have centuries, if not millennia, where the church has said, oh, well, we can't help that person or we can't help that group because they're sinners or they're terrible. And it's like, Jesus would say, have the exact same critique, right? Probably just call us out just as bluntly, right? We can be just as guilty of letting folks use the church to get around issues of justice and love and compassion, all of those kinds of things. So this is a debate, ultimately, Jesus makes it a debate, that is, about following God versus tradition, custom, or social norm, which hits a lot closer to home than whether or not you wash your hands. Thoughts, now that we have a little bit, hopefully that helps you get a little more context about what Jesus is talking about. What do we think? Certainly Jesus isn't pulling back. He's not pulling punches on this one.
I'm still having trouble understanding why this was Jesus's response. Because washing hands and pots and pans and dishes seems kind of reasonable to me, Bill. Okay. And
yes.
Okay. Particularly in these days of COVID, and to respond like, because they weren't asking him, why are your disciples and followers not following the law? Okay, why just, because it's just tradition and custom, but he brings up the law. And so I just don't understand. I don't see how one generated his response. It's like I'm missing something. Does that make sense?
That's why I started and said this is grumpy Jesus. I don't know either. He sort of goes nuclear on a question that's sort of a relatively innocuous, right? Like, why don't you guys wash their hands? It's like, oh, well, I'll tell you hypocrites. And you're like, whoa, who went to hypocrite land all of a sudden? Like, what are we? Wow.
Exactly. Yeah. So.
No, I agree. And I don't have an answer. I mean, that's where it really is just Jesus, like, suddenly sort of goes from one extreme to the other than maybe it is that sort of, and this is consonant, certainly, like God says this lots of different times, like, I'm tired of your festivals and all these outward signs that you care, like, oh, wow, you wash your hands, but you're not going to feed your mom's pouring on the street next door. What are you talking about? Who cares about your stupid hands, right? I mean, I could understand a little bit of that indignation, but it's definitely, it's 0 to 1,000 really quick.
Right.
Well, a couple things. To me, this is, we're going back to some points that Mark was making with Jesus before, and that is that, Jesus is saying what God really cares about is motivation. Mm-hmm. What are your motives for doing this stuff? And I like the way Mark has, this story follows immediately after the sentence that says, and whoever touched him became well. So right. we shift. So that's the scene. And then the next thing is the Pharisees are picking at him saying, well, wait a second, you guys aren't washing your hands. And it's like Jesus saying, I mean, yeah, and we're not told this is chronologically the next thing, but Mark wants us to be thinking, oh, Well, we've just gone from this world where people are being fed to the so they can't eat anymore, and everybody who touched them being mad. And now we've gone from that to picking at people about washing hands. And so then Jesus goes on from that to say, well, look at you. Well, motivation is what God cares about, and you let people dump their parents so they can pay more money to you as the priests. I mean, it's this critique of the Jerusalem temple cult. It's the same thing that we get into when he overturns the tables of the money changers. It says you're abusing the rules for your own benefit. That's not what God cares about. God cares about helping people.
Right. Yeah, I think that's fair. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Other thoughts? Anybody have any other thoughts? But yeah, I think it's all in. I mean, I think that's all part of this, right? I mean, I think there's definitely a certain righteous indignation that Jesus has.
Uh-huh.
And it's also, oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that all this money is going to the church. And it made me think about, you were talking about before Social Security and before all these things. When I was a little girl, my grandmother lived next door to us. I grew up on a farm, and we had a lot of land around us. And when my grandfather died, she didn't have a lot of resources. And so we built a small house. Well, her children, all the children contributed and built a small house next door to our house. And she didn't have resources, and all of her children were very active in church and supported their church, but they also took care of their mother. And so, and they gave her money and brought her things. And I loved having her next door because it meant that all my aunts and uncles and cousins were always coming because she was there. They would come to visit. And so it gave us kind of a real strong family unit, I think. But I think about the fact that, her children all made sure that she was cared for. But they still supported their church too. No, it wasn't either or.
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah. It was fun.
So, yeah, I mean, I think that's all part of it. It's the way it's supposed to work, right? Versus the way people are leaving family destitute or hurting, which we can all say that's obviously the wrong answer. Across. I was going to share the one other just totally random thing. The word hypocrite itself was pretty new around the time of Jesus. It came from Greek theater, and it was literally one who wore a mask, right? I mean, it was someone who on those Greek stages, they would wear masks as actors. And so a hypocrite was someone who would take off the mask and look differently than the one who wore the mask, right? That you might have a smiling face, but be angry or sad. So it's that sort of idea that we understand instinctively now, but literally meant to have two faces, right? To say, oh, I care about the temple and God, but if I take this mask off, I'm really revealed as someone who doesn't give a crap about anything but my own money and situation, right? I mean, that's clearly how Jesus intends it here, which we understand. That's not a new understanding, but it is just a name. It's a pretty brutal, when you know that that's the history of it, it's even more brutal on some level to know it's to be two-faced in that very clear way. All right, so Mark continues to drive home a little bit of this point. We can hear Jesus's next words in summation of his argument more clearly and perhaps a little bit differently. Then he called the crowd again. So he's had this fight with the Pharisees. I'm not sure then if he's calling the crowd inside or if he's gone outside and called a group together to teach them. This is a little unclear, but he called the crowd again and said to them, listen to me, all of you, and understand that there is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. When he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about the parable. And he said to them, then do you also fail to understand? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile? Since it enters not the heart, but the stomach, and goes out into the sewer. Thus he declared all foods clean. And he said, it is what comes out of a person that defiles. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come: fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. So this gets to Lynn's point. Obviously, it's not what goes in that defiles, but what comes out, right? Mark, who I ordinarily love, I think misses the point a little bit here. That is, hey, he's critiquing this people who use tradition to get around the law. I don't think he's necessarily totally making the declaration that Mark parenthetically says, thus he declared that all food is okay, right? Like, oh, well, now we can have bacon because Jesus said it's what comes from within that matters, not from what we eat. I don't think that was Jesus's point in this context. His point much more is, like Lynn was saying, right? This is intention. Like, this is where Mark is continuing a theme, or Jesus is continuing a thing, quite frankly, that has come from the beginning. God's much more concerned about our heart than necessarily every single action. Anyway, that's that. Again, I very rarely quibble with Mark, but I do think that random little parenthetical might be, I'm not sure if that's what Jesus is saying. It's not wrong, but it's not the point of what Mark is saying right there. Instead, I think it certainly states that what you eat does not defile you, and maybe you can draw that conclusion, but I think that's focusing on the wrong, it's the emphasis on the wrong syllable, right? Kind of thing that we say sometimes. Whether you eat bacon or not is not the point of the story. What the point of the story is, Jesus is hammering on people that use the traditions to enrich themselves, to avoid the obligations to one another, to do evil, right? I mean, he is trying to say this consonant, and it's consonant with his commentary and other things that are not in Mark, right? If you even look at a woman lustfully, you have committed adultery, right? In Mark and Matthew, he says that. It's this way of Jesus ultimately raising that fence that we've talked about, that Jews put fence around the law and say, well, you don't want to do this because that might lead you to be tempted. Jesus ultimately is not undoing the law so much as actually trying to say the law is so important, we should be far more careful about the things we say and the things we do so that we don't break the law. And is really ultimately hammering on that side of things more than he is hammering, I think, on, oh, we should peel back kosher rules today and have a ham sandwich. But yeah, who knows? Did I have something else on the next page? Yeah. So again, I think Jesus is building a higher fence around the law. It's not the menu that condemns you. It is your desire, your heart. In some ways, your very being, right? That's a much harder control than what you eat or how to prepare it, right? Which, to your point, Stefan, right? Like on one level, okay, fine, wash the dishes and the bronze kettles in your hands. Great, that. Why is Jesus getting so upset? But I think he's getting upset because it is coming back to, no, you aren't getting it, guys. You've got to understand it's your heart. That's what matters, right? This is totally the superficial stuff. Let's get to the real stuff. Doesn't stop him from seeming to be a pretty grumpy, but that is where it is. Thoughts about all of that?
Well, I think this is definitely the edgy Jesus here. And, from comparing the message with NRSV, it makes me suspect that the NRSV may understate some of Jesus' verbiage a little bit.
Oh, okay.
Because when it says, Jesus says, there is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. The way it's worded in the message is, listen now, all of you, take this to heart. It's not what you swallow that pollutes your life. It's what you vomit. That's the real pollution.
Nice.
And yeah, and at the end, then later on, it says in NRSV, and he said, it is what comes out of a person. No, I guess before that it says, do not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile, since it enters not from the heart, but since it enters not the heart, but the stomach, and goes out into the sewer.
Mhm.
What it says in Peterson is, Jesus said, "Are you being willfully stupid? Don't you see that? Don't you see that what you swallow can't contaminate you? It doesn't enter your heart, but your stomach works its way through your intestines and is finally flushed."
Nice.
So it's, I mean, it's pretty graphic, which makes me think that maybe the NRSV has sort of tamed it a bit.
Maybe. I would certainly. I mean, that's the freedom he can have in making a text that's about what does Jesus mean versus what's the literal translation.
Yeah, well, I'm just curious about what the Greek would be.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it's more strident or if he's just picking up on Jesus being strident. I don't know. I'd have to look at the Greek more. I think it's there. I definitely think it's there, just in the way Jesus has responded. He's pretty up in arms about the whole thing.
Between those two passages, Lynn, that you read in the Message, I love the verse that says, when he was back home after being with the crowd, his disciples said, "We don't get it. Put it in plain language."
Yeah.
Speaking for all of us.
Amen.
I've always been intrigued by the quotes that are in that, in not just Mark, but in the Bible, the quotes of Jesus. Who is sitting there and taking all this? Is this all oral tradition? Or is somebody sitting there with a pen and pencil or whatever was available at that time, writing all this down? How did all this happen?
Yeah.
Meaning the quotes.
That's a great question. The shortest answer is we don't know, Roy. We have no clue. That's the most truthful and honest answer. Especially if we really take it to heart that most of these were written 30 and 40 years after Jesus, after he has ascended, then it's like, well, wait, how did we get to this? And so there's a couple of ideas. One is that there were people who wrote down some things as Jesus was saying, or very shortly they started to realize this guy's important. We should be writing this down. And that would actually be consonant with Jewish tradition. There's, after all, lots of these series of, rabbinical sayings, like this rabbi said these important things, and they write it down and they record that because they realize that there's some good teaching there. And so there's a lot of conversation that ultimately, basically, someone could have been writing down some of Jesus's important sayings, and then when they started to write the Gospels, they had access to some of those sayings or to some of the basic outlines of the stories. I think it's fair to say that all of the quotes we have are from memory at some point or another. It's not likely that there was a scribe literally sort of doing dictation when Jesus was saying some of these things, but it was from memory, and it was from like, oh my gosh, do you remember that time Jesus got mad and called them hypocrites? I think some of these moments are just because they were memorable. And the story was one that they remembered as a result because there's something extraordinary that happened. And certainly some people believe that Jesus might have had a stump speech, sort of like an election stump speech. Like every time he went to another village, he taught the same 3 or 4 parables, had very similar kind of things that he said. Blessed are the meek was probably said more than once. And that's why a lot of people remembered it, because he said it a lot. But again, these are all theories, I don't know if we'll ever know for sure on this side of glory exactly what Jesus said and maybe how we quoted him wrong, or we got the basic idea but didn't get every detail because we were doing it from, someone who remembered hearing Jesus preach 20 years before. Who knows? Who knows?
Thanks.
Sure. That's a great question, but it's one that's hard because it is that kind of, wait a second. How did this get in our hands?
Just looking at the footnotes in NRSV, an interesting thing is that to the comment you had about the last part of verse 19, it says, "Thus he declared all foods clean."
Yeah.
The footnote comment on that is perhaps a later addition to the text.
It could be. Yeah, Mark might not even have said that. Somebody else just said, "Yeah, this is where, yeah, here it is. Here's the moment where I can have bacon and ham." Yeah, who knows? All right, well, so we'll look to the next, which is, again, equally Jesus being grumpy or with not the response we'd want. So from there, he set out and went away to the region of Tyre, and he entered a house and did not want anyone to know where he was, or know he was there. Yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit, immediately, Euthus, heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." Yeah, good. Yes, that's the appropriate response, Stefan. I see you shaking your head. Yes. But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she
I
went
love
home.
this story.
Yeah. So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. All right. So, yeah, I don't like saying it, but Jesus is a jerk in this story at best, and perhaps even worse. So he calls the woman a dog in an era where they were mainly strays. Dogs were not beloved pets in the ancient world. That people occasionally had pets that were dogs, but usually they were just strays running through the roads. They were mangy, they were gross, and they just sort of ate up whatever trash was in the street. So calling someone a dog was an insult in those days. Still is an insult in these days. Let's be honest. It's not really a high, even now when we love our dogs, it's still not high praise to call someone a dog. It was insulting in the first century, right? And so after talking about following the law and caring for others, basically we catch Jesus ignoring his own teaching, right? He spent all this time saying we should care for each other and be loving and, follow the law that says all these things. And then, this woman comes in and very squarely asks him for something that's reasonable, and he does not respond well. Jewish scholar Joseph Klausner notes, if any other Jewish teacher of the time had said such a thing, Christians would never have forgiven Judaism for it. To give you an idea of how insulting this is. I mean, it's that bad. It really is. And I think he's probably right. Like if a rabbi had said this, had called a Christian a dog, we would have said, "Oh my gosh, can you believe that? It's the worst thing and for ecumenical relations in history and everything else," right? It is not a high praise. And it is that bad. And we can't explain it away. And to be clear, Mark doesn't. The amazing thing is how many, and I read several different, scholars and folks reporting on this, all the ways people try to turn it and say like, "Oh, well, Jesus was challenging the woman. Jesus knew all things and he's challenging her to see how strong her faith was, and intentionally said these awful things to see if she would respond well, knowing that she would." Or other people say, "Oh, well, maybe she was a rich woman who was taking advantage of the poor and it was similar to the last thing." Well, that's not in the text. That's nothing's in there about any of that. It's just an attempt for us to try and say, wow, Jesus was being a jerk. What do we do with that when Jesus is not nice? and not just not nice, but pretty intentionally mean, it seems like, right? It puts us in a really uncomfortable spot. That's one side of it. The other side of it then, and this is a great line, as Sharon Ring states, it looks like Jesus was caught with his compassion down. I love that turn of phrase, right? Is caught with his compassion down, indeed. Now we can say, so Tyre, and I preached about this whenever this came up this summer. Tyre is actually literally, it's way north. It's about 15 miles, 20 miles north of the northern border of ancient and modern Israel. It's Gentile territory. It is a coastal city. It's in fact an island. It's really an isthmus now, but it's an island out in the Mediterranean. So for Jesus to go up there, we can say that basically Jesus was trying to go on vacation. He was trying to get away from everybody. He was exhausted and wanted a break. I don't think that's reading too much into the text. If you know where the geography is, he's literally he's on this tiny little island in the Mediterranean, away from Israel, away from hopefully anybody who knows who the heck he is. And that's even what the text says, right? He didn't want anyone to know he was there. He didn't want anybody to know what's going on. The dude's looking for a break. Not to say that he then deserves to be a jerk to anybody, but we can say that that's probably the context of the situation, that he is out there. It's a fascinating side story, super fast history of Tyre. It was an island that resisted when Alexander the Great came through about 250 years before Jesus. When he came through to conquer the region, the people of Tyre refused to acquiesce to this young 27-year-old marauding king. And he didn't like that. So because Alexander was crazy as much as he was also great, he ordered his men to fill the ocean with rocks and to basically create a roadway across the ocean to get to that island. So it's no longer an island, it's an isthmus because of Alexander the Great filled it in with rocks. And then it became this isthmus instead of an island. It'd be like somebody saying, I need to get to Hilton Head. No, don't get in boats. We'll just fill it with a bunch of rocks. You guys throw some rocks in the water and we'll build it up and no problem, right? It's crazy. But that's what he did. So the woman responds, as Jesus gets caught with his compassion down, the woman responds with a desperate faith that will accept any insult to get her child healed. What we talked about earlier, remember we talked about this is true faith according to Mark. Faith is not some sort of, agreeing to ideal facts. It's saying, you can heal me and I am not going to do anything other than get what I need, because I have to get what I need. My child's going to die if I don't get what I need. So I am going to absolutely, you want to call me a dog? Call me a dog. You want to call me terrible things? Call me terrible things. Will you just heal? We just do the things that, just help me, right? Which again, this is again constant with how Mark understands faith, right? Like this is where people come to Jesus and he goes, oh, your faith has made you well. Yeah, because of this, right? Like you won't take no for an answer, even from Jesus. So yeah, faith is not that esoteric agreement to ideals. It's desperately clinging to hope for results. That's Mark's seeming definition of faith. Not, oh, I agree that you are the Christ or the Messiah. It's, you can heal and I'm not leaving until you do. So Jesus changes his heart and mind, I would argue. And for some people, that's a real theological problem. Oh no, what does it mean that Jesus learns something? And he heals the woman, right? Your faith has made you well. Now, I don't have a problem, let me be super clear, with Jesus as a human learning at any point. I think that's what it is to be human. You have to make mistakes and learn. But there's certainly that belief that a divine side of Jesus is without error or fault, and extending them to say that Jesus must also be all of those things to become the Lamb without blemish, to be the perfect sacrifice for the sin of the world. That's where the theological problem comes in. People want to say Jesus can't have made a mistake here because then is he sinful or is he broken or is he terrible? And for me, I'm just, well, he's human. And that doesn't hurt my feelings. But it does upset some folks a whole lot to hear that Jesus might have been wrong in a situation. or have made an assumption that was not of the highest ideal. Right? So from Placker, well, actually, so that's the issue that people typically have with this verse. I personally, I love it because I love to think that the human side of Jesus could be tired and grumpy and say the wrong thing, and also then learn from someone who's got more faith on that day than even Jesus does, right? I mean, I think that's a pretty extraordinary moment, and one that you can preach and teach on a lot easier than Jesus was just sort of detached and teaching a lesson kind of idea. What do you all think about this verse? There's another Placker quote that's great that I think will help as well, but wanted to see what y'all thought of this verse.
I love this story for two different reasons, or maybe even two levels. One is I actually loved, and this is why I love Mark so much. Okay, this experiencing this human side of Jesus. Okay, his humanity. I absolutely love it. I also find it interesting that in this story, the hero is not Jesus, it's the Syrophoenician woman.
Mhm. Absolutely.
I love it.
Cool.
I just absolutely, this is one of my favorites. I just love it. I wish I could give you all the reasons why, Bill. I just do.
Mhm.
No, I think it's a neat editing job by Mark, because we just had Jesus calling out the Pharisees for being hypocrites and saying God looks to the heart, God cares about the motivation of the people. God's not concerned about following rules just for the sake of following rules. And here's Jesus saying, well, you're not in the in crowd. You say you get the leftovers. I love what Peterson does with that. I mean, what NRSV translates as, then he said to her, for saying that you may go, the demon has left your daughter. The Message says, Jesus was impressed. You're right. Your daughter is no longer disturbed. The demonic affliction is gone. So, I mean, in that sense, there's sort of an aha moment there. And it's like, okay, I was doing the same thing I was criticizing the Pharisees for. And I, if I recall correctly, Matthew and Luke they're not as hard on Jesus in this description. I mean, I think it seems like, if I recall, they smooth the edges a little bit.
Let me grab, I'm going to look at I have the parallel gospel up here real quick. I'm going to look it up real quick, but yeah. I think you're right.
I think it's interesting. I don't have an answer, but I think it'd be interesting as we go through the rest of Mark to see if we think this is supposed to indicate some sort of shift in Jesus's view as he lives out, the rest of the story.
Well, we can say that, absolutely. So what happens after this, Jesus had been, if we look at sort of the chronology of how he has dealt with Gentiles, he went and drove out the Gerasene demoniac. That didn't go too well. They asked him to leave. They thought he was crazy. Then he sort of came back one time, healed some people, hung out for a little while, but he didn't stay. This one leads to a direct change, because where he goes next after this, he goes to the Decapolis, that is the 10 Greek / Gentile cities, and preaches the good news. Like, he literally begins a mission to the Gentiles after this. And Mark's not explicit. He doesn't say, and then he went to the Gentiles or changed his mind and went to the Gentiles. But the story is told in such a way that it sure seems like he goes, oh, I need to go tell them. Right. I need to open this to others.
Yeah. And I think Mark is not writing to a Jewish community. So,
Right.
because he's explaining some of these Jewish customs so that you can gather that the believing community he's addressing is not composed primarily of Jews. So, it makes sense that he wants to show some sort of evolution here.
Let's see, 116. I'm almost there for looking at what Mark and others have about all of this. Or Matthew and Luke. So again, they go to Tyre and Sidon. They enter the house. Didn't want them to know we're there. Matthew tells another whole story. He does a whole different take where the woman sort of follows him around for a while before he denies her. He says the same words, but she's more insistent in Matthew's version. Matthew's version. Luke doesn't have it. Luke doesn't even use the story. So, yeah. Anyway.
So, and we know that Matthew and Luke had this.
Yes.
And so they got to decide, what am I going to do with it? And Luke says, well, I think I'll pass on this one.
Yeah, Luke basically goes, that's, I don't know about that one.
I guess I would like to, I have a question that just popped in my mind, Bill.
Yeah.
How did the Syrophoenician woman know about Jesus if he's supposedly in Tyre? Okay.
Yeah, that's a great question.
I mean, how did he know? How did she know that he had the ability to heal his daughter? I just popped in my mind. How'd she know?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he's 15, 20 miles deep into enemy territory, for lack of a better term, into a Gentile world that shouldn't know him and hiding out, like wants to be left alone. So yeah, it's sort of like, how does I think we could make it consonant and say, like, how on earth did that person find George Clooney on the Amalfi Coast, right? Like, how did they know he was there? How did they know what was going on, right? A friend of a friend, or somebody said, hey, I know some people, go talk to them. And it speaks at least to the persistence of the woman, right? Like, for her to find this person or hear about this person, track him down, find him, beg, all of it, right? I mean, it just speaks to her faith for sure.
It kind of echoes of the Elijah story.
I think so.
I mean, he goes to Syria, and he's, to the woman's child is dying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's all in there. So Placker makes an interesting turn that I thought was great with this. That might be something, Stefan, that you have considered, or maybe not, right? For part of the reason why we love this, and that is, our faith needs to be, as Luther said, such that even when God's goodness is concealed, we will not imagine that the God we know in Jesus Christ ultimately is or may be ungracious. Right? That there's something about our faith here that there are times when it sure seems like God's being mean to us, or at least not present, or his goodness is concealed. We can all name those moments in our lives, right? But at the same time, our faith needs to be one that we say, no, but God is good. So how do I need to be like this woman and say, all right, this is a crappy situation, but I need to know what's going on. I need you to know, God, I know you're not ungracious, but help me understand this, what is happening in my life, right? Which I thought was a very helpful way. It's via Luther, but I think Placker is spot on for part of the power of this story, right? It speaks to just being human as well. Like, it's Jesus being human, but also the very real way that we have to deal with our lives, and then to deal with God in the midst of that.
That quote. I think
Yeah.
too, to double back a little bit, the fact that Jesus was mean or learned in that situation or changed his mind, that was a piece of his human experience.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, if I'm on the vacation and someone calls and needs help, that's not my I might be a little more gracious, but maybe not, depending on where you catch me. Like anything, like, oh, I'm here to get away, not to hear more of this.
Mhm.
Absolutely. It's good stuff.
It is. Mark
Yeah, Mark is good.
is
So-
good.
Holy. So the next week we'll do the second half or the end of chapter 7, which the next part is healing of the deaf and mute man, which is interesting. It's sort of a continuation of some of these healing stories that Jesus does. And like I said, this is where he starts to make a turn and heal people in the Gentile side of the country, which is interesting. He definitely begins to proclaim the good news to those that he had just declared, literally just declared, oh, y'all are a bunch of dogs. You don't deserve the healing. I'm a Jewish Messiah. Oh, maybe I was wrong on that. If I'm the Messiah, maybe I'm to more than just the Jews, right? Which we've all been struggling with ever since. Good stuff. All right, my friends, anything else we want to tag, talk about, question, wonder today? All right, perfect. We all have a great day. We'll see you Sunday.
You too. Thanks,
Thank you, Bill.
Stay
Thank you.
dry, everybody.
Bye-bye,
You
everybody.
too.
Bye.
Bye.